And just to make sure the sound works, yay, the sound works really great. Well, during the break, I was sitting here praying for you. This is my first time at the Climb Conference. And can someone start that 30-minute video so that I know, or 30 minutes? I want to make sure I have my timer moving. Dun, da, da, da. It's coming. As long as it doesn't start, then I have time. When I came last night, my first time visiting this conference, I just honestly have been so impressed. I appreciate you so much. I think as someone who's ministered almost his entire ministry life in big churches, this is a group I haven't had a chance to interact with a lot, and I have so much respect for you. So it's really an honor for me to be here, and I hope the things that I share with you today you will find helpful in your own spiritual journey. Real quick, I know some of you, I don't know a lot of you. This is my family. My wife and I have been married for over 30 years. We have two amazing daughters, Hannah and Maddie. Hannah is married and in the ministry in Chicago, and we have two grandladies, which are my pride and joy. I love having grandchildren. It really is a blessing. A little bit about my context and where I come from. I did spend 26 years in full-time ministry, and I was converted in Minnesota, Minneapolis, 15 years in Chicago. We spent 4 years I asked them to do that, by the way, because I have a very heavy AV. We spent 4 years in Johannesburg, South Africa, building both ministry training academies. We had 82 churches across Africa and no theological training for our church leaders, so we started schools first in Joburg, then in Kenya, in Nairobi, in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, and there was also one in Lagos, Nigeria. We started a publishing company when we lived there called Grounded. I know some of you have used some of our content, but that's really been my life's work up until 2017. It's 2016. After the REACH conference in 2016, I went to Ghana for the equivalent West African Leadership Conference. And when I got on an airplane to come home, I sent my wife a text and I said, "There's something wrong with me. I feel broken inside." And I got home and I had no gas left in the tank. I laid on my bed for a number of days. I wasn't able to unpack my suitcase, check my email. I was non-functional. And fortunately, we were given 3 months off to try to so I could catch my breath and figure out what was going on. I have never had a mental health challenge in my life. I was diagnosed with general depressive disorder, general anxiety disorder, and ADHD. The ADHD everybody already knew, but it was an official diagnosis. And it was a very dark time. In February, this is what my bedside table looked like. I was on medication to sleep, medication for anxiety, just all kinds of different medications, and really started asking a lot of questions. I think the biggest question for me was, what is second half of life spirituality supposed to look like? I think in looking around at our fellowship, I saw a lot of people like me who had devoted their life to the cause. And I didn't know people who could speak to what spiritual maturity looked like, and so I wanted to go back to school to study that. I entered into this PhD program in 2017. 4 students are accepted in this PhD program every year. It's the only real dedicated spirituality PhD program in North America, and this was my cohort, and I would joke with them, I get to take a 5-year sabbatical to study. And they're like, "This is not a sabbatical, Dave." And I'm like, I get to take a 5-year. Yeah, after coming out of the ministry, I this would be fantastic. I decided to devote my research and my work to understanding spiritual crisis and looking specifically at spiritual wilderness and spiritual darkness and how that affected me, but more even, how does this unpack in our fellowship of churches? What's the context in the ICOC? My second year, I actually did an entire year of study on the Stone Campbell movement. I looked at Barton Stone's spirituality, Alexander Campbell's spirituality. I looked at our initiation rites. I looked at our discipling practices. I wrote all of my academic papers just trying to unpack the ICOC for my own benefit. I ended up doing my PhD dissertation on this topic, Lost at Sea, How the Journey of Wandering Christians Reveals the Need for a Reimagined Church Culture in Protestant Evangelicalism. In other words, how do we minister to people who are going through spiritual wilderness? I personally felt like the church wasn't prepared to handle me. And I already had to apologize. Today I actually got a chance to apologize. The poor guy, Jeff Henderson, I don't know if he's in here. Jeff was the poor man who had to take over my ministry when I stepped down when I was in crisis. So he was leading the ministry I was leading with me in it when I was in a crisis. That's a tough gig for anybody. So just as an FYI, my book on this it got picked up by an academic publisher. It's called Cries from the Wilderness, and it will be coming out in December if anyone's interested in that. So I get this question a lot. What is spirituality? What is spirituality? There's a lot of misunderstanding around what is spirituality. And I think it's really simple, actually, at its core to understand. If theology is how we think, spirituality is how we live. So it encompasses a lot of things. How do we engage God? How are we transformed because of our engagement with God? How do we treat our family? How do we interact with the world around us? How do we posture ourselves in this world as ambassadors for Christ? And that, of course, includes all kinds of things. Disciplines and practices, informative, elements, but it encompasses even how we think spiritually. So our theology feeds our spirituality, right? Another great analogy that I like for this is a sports metaphor. So if we were to think about a game of any sort, the rules to the game are our theology. But how we play the game, that's our spirituality. Unfortunately, in the Protestant world in which we live, we spend so much time talking about the rules to the game. And we need rules, right? I mean, no game works without the rules to the game. But we spend very little time talking about how we play the game, how we engage God, how we live in love with our neighbors and our families, what that means with how we posture ourselves in the world, etc., etc. So we'll get into some of this here today. I now am working for the Disciples Center for Education. We formed a nonprofit in 2020, and the entire purpose of this nonprofit is to help advance education in the ICOC. That's why it exists. We really believe that because we haven't prioritized theological education, we have a problem with a lack of depth and nurturing, especially with our older Christians, and that's something we can fix. And that's really what we're ambitiously trying to pursue. So the Disciples Center for Education team is myself as executive director, Joel Nagel. Many of you still might think Joel Nagel leads a church. He does not. Joel is not leading the Lansing Church anymore. Joel's working full-time writing content to help feed our churches. So grateful for him. There's only one Joel Nagel. Super grateful for our partnership. And then we have our operations manager, Angie Schmidt, who's in Chicago. We started by developing partnerships with like-minded churches that really were interested in going deeper. A year ago, we contracted a kind of a 3-year relationship with the Canadian family of churches, the 11 churches across Canada, and we've been working with them for a year to develop quality content and a way of thinking that can really shape the culture of the Canadian churches. You'll hear more about that here over the next couple days. Chicago took a different take on this. Chicago basically said, we want you to come in and evaluate the church top to bottom. We want you to look at everything that's happening, what's going on in our children's ministry classes in all 7 ministry centers. How do we think about teaching our young Christians? What's happening in our teen ministries, our campus ministries? What are we doing at the pulpit? How are we feeding our older Christians? There is no stone you can't turn over. And I thought, wow, I really respect and appreciate that humility. We started that engagement in July, and it's been a really incredible 6-month journey with Chicago that will extend for the next couple of years. I'm excited to share that we are going to be doing the same thing in Dallas. We've just started that relationship. So excited to... And so tomorrow morning, by the way, you might see a bunch of house church leaders showing up. We're going to have a meeting next door with all the house church leaders in Dallas to talk about this relationship. We also started an academic journal. If you're looking for a place that's doing deep and thoughtful work, and how do we start engaging important questions around our theology and our spirituality, we launched Teleos about 3 years ago. You can see examples of the journal back at our table if you want to go look at it, and you can find out all kinds of more things about, Teleos. So that's Teleos. We wanted to create a safe space so we could explore necessary things and bring in experts in those fields. So we started doing a conference where we invited in top experts in these fields. So this year at Oklahoma Christian University, we hosted a conference on Gen Z. And we brought in the top speaker, David Kinnaman from Barna. Many of you may have read Faith for Exiles, so we had him come in. We had the dean of the theological school from Pepperdine come in. We had a young scholar who's at Abilene Christian come in. We had Dudley Chansey at Oklahoma, who's a really good friend of mine, who's been doing a study on the role that grandparents play in formation of their grandkids. And he came and shared 2 years of research with us. So we're trying to do really important, deep work that will help feed us for the long run. And then when we host these conferences and have these speakers come, we then turn around and publish those talks in the journal. So the Gen Z conference will be published in this next upcoming journal. This February in San Antonio, we're hosting one on the intersection of Scripture and spirituality, which I would really argue are kind of the two lungs of the way we live and breathe, how we read and engage God's Word and what it means for the way we live our life. And we have a really amazing group of 9 PhDs coming in from all over the United States that are experts around both the Stone Campbell movement and outside to speak to us on those topics. In 2025, we're going to be going to Abilene, and we're going to talk about the spirituality of our history, the Stone Campbell heritage, past, present, and future. How do we think about how we live this Christian life, and what is our past informed, and how do we need to think going forward? So those are a few things that we're working on. You're going to hear a little bit more about Thread in the second half. Thread is a podcast and a resource that we're trying to build to share with churches like yourself to feed our Christians. So that's just some introductory what's been going on in my life. I want to get to the text that I was asked to speak about. You know, a lot of times when you're asked to speak at events, you're given really weird titles that have nothing to do with your work. This could not have been a better tee-up for the world that I live in. So thank you, conference coordinators, for giving me this scripture. Super excited about this, 2 Corinthians chapter 4. It says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show us that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." You know what drove me from the very beginning of my call to follow Jesus? And I have to say, just as a fun anecdotal side note, my campus minister is here. Lisa Payne was leading the campus ministry in Minneapolis, Minnesota in June of 1990 when I became a Christian. It's so amazing to see her. And I remember feeling so moved by God in my conversion. I studied the Bible for 8 days and got baptized. And out of the waters, I was like, civil engineering, who cares? I want the world to know what I found. And it propelled me into an aggressive life of ministry. And ever since that time, my passion has been to help people know the God that I know, right? That's this treasure we have. And yet it is in a jar of clay. The second half of this verse becomes very vivid as you've been around for any length of time. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. Perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. You know, when I think about this, and particularly I was asked to talk about perplexed, but not in despair. When I think about what that means, to be perplexed and not in despair, it means that God is always at work forming, shaping, and transforming us, but never in such a way that we can't hold on. Now, if you actually look at the Greek, this is one of those texts that actually makes more sense because of the way that the Greek rhymes. So, or maybe not rhymes, but the way the wordplay works. So the word perplexed is actually aporeo, and that means to be in doubt or to be uncertain. Now, have you ever felt that way? To be in doubt or to be uncertain. But he says, you're aporeo, but you're not ex-aporeo. So you're in doubt, but you're not in too much doubt. You may be uncertain, but you're not going to cross over to the level of difficulty where you're embarrassed. It's like God holds us in this liminal space where you're barely holding on and you don't think you can anymore, but He still holds on. It's why the Genesis 32 story of Jacob wrestling with God is one of my favorite stories in the Bible, because how does a 97-year-old man wrestle all night with God? Because the idea here is that the wrestling match goes on far longer than you think you can handle, but God is always holding you right there. Perplexed, but not in despair. I want you to think about the most transformative times in your life. My guess is they've most likely happened in times of wilderness. Now, when we're in them, we have a very difficult time attributing them to God. And that's really what I want to do today, is give a little framework to this. So when we think about the many ways that we think about wilderness or struggle, it's all over the Scriptures. I mean, I would argue that there is nothing more prevalent in the Bible than the story of the struggle. So in the New Testament, we talk about suffering or hardship. I mean, I already talked about the Genesis 32, wrestling with God. We talk a lot about wrestling with God. But the whole story of Israel and Yahweh is the story of the struggle. Do you remember what Israel's name means? He who struggles with God and overcomes. So this idea, if we look at what is the biblical language that's used for this, it's wilderness. It's all over. It's wilderness. It's wilderness. It's wilderness. And we think, and we're going to unpack what that means, what wilderness means biblically for us. But when we think about a biblical theology, how do we think about what the Bible's telling us and how to think about the struggle? We see these paradigms and we see these models of Israel. Israel, forming a nation takes 40 years in the wilderness before they're ready to go to the promised land. In fact, there's no promised land without the wilderness. Probably need to say that again, right? There's no promised land without wilderness. We see this not only with Israel, we see it, John. Where did John come from? Out of the wilderness. Where did Jesus start his ministry? In the wilderness. Where did Moses spend, after being raised in Pharaoh's palace and having all the leadership skills he needed that the world could teach him, where did he actually get his final formation? 40 years in the wilderness. So think about that. 40 years being trained in the Pharaoh's palace, 40 years being trained and formed by God in the wilderness, only to go back to get the people of Israel and bring them back for another 40 years in the wilderness. Sometimes we think that wilderness is a temporary space. One of the things I've come to grips with is that wilderness is always a part of our spiritual life. The spiritual writers have been talking about this for a long time. One of the contemporaries of John Calvin and Martin Luther was trying to bring about reform within the Catholic Church, while the other reformers were trying to make reformation outside of the church. He was imprisoned for his efforts. His name was John of the Cross. He was put in a dark, damp cell for 9 months because he was trying to bring about spiritual change within the church. And after 9 months and coming out, he wrote a poem called The Dark Night of the Soul. And he says this about this difficult, dark time. O fortunate and choicest wound, you were made only for delight, and the quality of your affliction is delight, and gratification for the wounded soul. You are great, O delightful wound, because he who caused you is great. How or what kind of work has to happen in someone's soul to be able to say that about being imprisoned by your brethren? He recognized that it is God's hand in love and for love that's allowing this to shape me. When I look at my life, I really believe that it's God's grand gestures that have brought me to where I am today, and those grand gestures have typically come in crisis. So in 1990, when I got baptized at the University of Minnesota, I was in a spiritual crisis. And I could tell you that story. I don't have time today, but we all have those stories. We were in a crisis. God rescued us and brought us in our crisis through a transformative time into His glory. But it's not like it's one and done, right? I mean, crisis and conversion is part of the spiritual life. In 2003, many of us were around and experienced a crisis with our community. And that crisis led to transformation. For me, it drove me back to school and helped me try to rethink and reorient my life. In 2009, while I was in Chicago, after 15 years and building youth and family ministry and feeling very comfortable, we felt this needs crisis. We were people started telling us about what was happening in Africa. In Johannesburg, we had 150 teenagers that were members of our church that were not Christians. We were told there are 4 disciples out of 150 teenagers in Johannesburg. And that crisis ended up leading to about 6 months of prayer and fasting and input and advice, and us uprooting from Chicago with our 12 and 14-year-old daughters and moving to Africa. Crisis. In 2016, I already told you my personal crisis that led me. These are the moments where I believe God worked in powerful ways to shape who I became. It's helpful if I put the slide up, right? It's a hard thing with having 2. I love this passage in Hosea. God tells us explicitly about how He uses wilderness to shape us. Therefore, I am now going to allure her. I will lead her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. There I will give her back her vineyards and make the valley of Achor, which means the valley of trouble, a door of hope. Isn't that powerful? I will make the valley of trouble a door of hope. There she will respond as in the days of her youth, as in the day she came up out of Egypt. In that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and you will no longer call me my master. Why does God take us into the wilderness? To speak gently to us, to reorient us, to get our attention, to remind us of what it's about, right? It's in love and for love. So briefly, let's talk about a theology and a spirituality of wilderness and frame this in 7 minutes or less. How do we think about wilderness? So wilderness in the Scriptures is a geographic place, but it's also a place where we see a paradigm form, a creation and a transformation paradigm. I'll explain briefly. In geography, in Scripture, it always means something. There are certain things that happen on the mountains. There are certain things that happen in the garden. There are certain things that happen on the plains and the valleys. There are other things that happen on the seas. And there are things that only happen in the wilderness. Test me in this. Go look at your Bibles and explore the ways geography communicates intimacy with God. So geography works to help us as a paradigm to understand God, even as He brings Israel out of the desert, He says to them, using geography as a test, as a place to draw their attention, He says this, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard them crying out because of their slave drivers. I'm concerned about their suffering, so I've come down to rescue them, to bring them up out of that land and move them to a different geographic place, a good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. And God used that as a motivation. As a matter of fact, we see this sharp contrast develop really quickly, right? Egypt is this place where we had meat and bread, where we lived in fullness, so we thought. But it wasn't everything we wanted. It's not everything God intended. God had to bring them out of that space into a place of hunger where there was death and difficulty and disorientation in order to bring them to fullness the way God intended fullness, the promised land filled with milk and honey. We can look at this through these two paradigms as well. So in wilderness, God does two things. God shapes out of nothing, and God reforms something that already exists. If we think about wilderness as a creation paradigm, we can look at passages like this and go, okay, out of nothing God creates. Let's look. In Isaiah 41, when the poor and needy seek water and there is none, and their tongue is parched with thirst, I, the Lord, will answer them. I, the God of Israel, will not forsake them. I will open the rivers in the bare heights and the fountains in the midst of the valley. I will make the wilderness a pool of water and dry land springs of water. And he goes on and describes how out of nothing God brings life. So God, as the agent, the one doing the work, out of nothing creates life where there is no life. We also see wilderness as a transformation paradigm. We see here when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road to the Philistine country, though it was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around the desert toward the Red Sea. In other words, think about, I know this is the easier route, but that's not going to get the results we need. So God says, I'm going to take you this way into the wilderness to shape you and form you into what I need you to become. Have you ever sat and considered what happened in the 40 years that Israel was in the desert? If you look at the before and after picture, when they came out of Egypt, they had none of these things. When they entered the promised land, they had all of these things. Military, a tribal structure, a government structure, civil law, spiritual law, rhythms. I appreciate Joel talking about the importance of seasons and rhythms, a culture, and most importantly, God made God's self known to God's people. It's the most important thing that happens in the wilderness. God makes God's self known to God's people. We also need to think about spirituality as a wilderness as a spirituality. See how fast I'm trying to move? How did Israel navigate this? How did Moses navigate this? How do we navigate this? There's two sides of looking at the spirituality. One is what God is doing, and one is what we do. And both are always at play in the wilderness. God is working, and we are working. Belden Lane says, it's a place of letting go. It's a place of dying, yet it's also a place of coming alive. The desert is where things fall apart and where things come together, often in an unanticipated way. So the question that we really have to ask is, what is God doing in wilderness? God is trying to help us to think about what we are to become and who we're going to be. Where are we going to land? How does the outcome of this thing look? You remember when Israel got out to the wilderness and they were like, we want to go back to the flesh pots of meat? And that's really the question that we have to ask ourselves. There's three things that can happen when you find yourself in this space where you feel like God has put you in the wilderness. You can either return to what you knew, which tends to be the more comfortable path, or we can get stuck there and not grow through it. A lot of people do, by the way. Or you can really lean in and trust and surrender and say, what is God doing in my life to help me become different? So, a couple things to think about for us. I think wilderness serves many purposes in our spiritual life. It's a place of emptying. It's a place of testing. It's a place to be still. It's a place of God's presence. It's a place of naming. That's a whole nother conversation, but an important one. It's a place to be called, and it's a place to be filled. The last thing I want to share before we take a break is this. Why do some people stay faithful to the path when God takes them through these difficulties and some don't? I've wrestled with this a lot over the last 6 years. And I want to share with you my personal creed about how I think about what God does in these spaces. I believe that I am made in the image and likeness of God. I believe that I am loved by God and in love and for love, and God works in my life. I believe that I have been given unique gifts to serve God's kingdom. I believe I walk in the Spirit in shared agency, meaning the Spirit leads and shapes me, but I am responsible to humbly listen and discern and follow the Spirit's lead. I believe this active life in the Spirit carries a both and blessing. It gives me hope for the life to come, but it's so much more than that. It's the grand adventure. It's life to the full. We're going to come back after the break, and I want to talk a little bit about the context that we live in the ICOC, the wilderness that I think our fellowship is in, and what we can learn and how we can move forward. We're going to take a 10-minute break. Thank you. I'm sorry?